In the spring of 1945, the Third Reich stood on the brink of total collapse. After nearly 6 years of devastating warfare that had consumed Europe and cost tens of millions of lives, the Nazi regime's final chapter was about to be written in the rubble-strewn streets of its own capital. By April 1945, Germany was being crushed between two massive forces. From the west, American, British, and French armies had crossed the Rhine and were driving deep into German territory. From the east, the Soviet Red Army, fueled by an unquenchable desire for vengeance after the horrors inflicted upon their homeland, was racing toward Berlin. The Soviet advance had been relentless. After breaking the back of the Wehrmacht at Stalingrad and Kursk, the Red Army had pushed the Germans back across Eastern Europe. Warsaw, Budapest, and Vienna had fallen. Now Marshal Georgy Zhukov and Marshal Ivan Konov commanded over 2 million Soviet troops, supported by more than 6,000 tanks and 40,000 artillery pieces, all poised to deliver the final blow. Adolf Hitler, the architect of Germany's destruction, had retreated into his Führerbunker beneath the Reich Chancellery. The once mighty dictator who had promised a 1,000-year Reich was now a physical and mental wreck, his hands trembling, his health shattered by years of drug abuse and the crushing weight of inevitable defeat. Yet he refused to leave Berlin, clinging to delusions of miraculous salvation and phantom armies that existed only in his fevered imagination. The city Hitler refused to abandon was already dying. Allied bombing raids had reduced much of Berlin to ruins. Food was scarce, water supplies were failing, and the civilian population lived in constant terror. The city's defenders were a desperate mixture of exhausted Wehrmacht veterans, teenage boys from the Hitler Youth, and elderly men from the Volkssturm Home Guard. They were armed with whatever weapons could be scraped together, facing an enemy that vastly outnumbered and outgunned them. On April 16, 1945, the final assault began. At 3 a.m, Soviet artillery opened fire in what may have been the largest bombardment in history. Thousands of guns fired simultaneously, turning the night into day and the earth into hell. The barrage was so intense that it could be heard over 100 miles away. When it lifted, Soviet infantry and tanks surged forward. The Germans fought with the desperation of men who knew they had nothing left to lose. At the Seelow Heights, the last major defensive position before Berlin, they inflicted heavy casualties on the attacking Soviets. But numbers and firepower took their toll. Within days, Soviet forces had broken through and were advancing on Berlin from multiple directions. By April 23rd, Soviet artillery was shelling the city centre. The battle for Berlin had become a brutal house-to-house, street-by-street struggle. Soviet troops fought their way through the ruins, clearing buildings with grenades, flamethrowers, and point-blank tank fire. The Germans contested every block, turning apartment buildings into fortresses and using the rubble as cover. Casualties on both sides were horrific. In the bunker, Hitler's grip on reality continued to slip. He issued orders to armies that no longer existed and raged at generals who dared to tell him the truth. He blamed everyone but himself for Germany's fate. The generals, the German people, the Jews. On April 22nd, after learning that his orders for a counterattack could not be carried out, Hitler finally admitted that the war was lost. But still, he would not leave. As Soviet forces tightened their noose around the city centre, the situation became increasingly surreal. Above ground, soldiers fought and died amid the ruins while terrified civilians huddled in cellars and subway tunnels. Below ground, in the bunker, Hitler went through the motions of command, moving phantom divisions on maps, while the sound of Soviet artillery grew ever closer. On April 29th, with Soviet troops just blocks away, Hitler married his longtime companion, Eva Braun, in a brief civil ceremony. He then dictated his political testament, a document that showed he had learnt nothing and regretted nothing. He blamed the Jews for the war and expelled Hermann Göring and Heinrich Himmler from the Nazi Party for attempting to negotiate with the Allies. The next day, April 30th, 1945, as Soviet soldiers fought their way toward the Reich Chancellery, Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun committed suicide in the bunker. Hitler shot himself while Braun took cyanide. Their bodies were carried up to the garden, doused with gasoline and burned. The man who had plunged the world into its most destructive war was dead. But the battle for Berlin continued. Hitler's successor, Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz was in northern Germany and had no control over the situation in the capital. The remaining German forces in Berlin fought on, some out of loyalty, others out of fear of Soviet retribution, still others simply because they saw no alternative. On May 2nd, the commander of the Berlin garrison, General Helmuth Weidling, finally ordered a ceasefire and surrendered. Soviet soldiers raised the red flag over the Reichstag, the symbolic heart of German power, in one of the war's most iconic moments. The battle for Berlin was over. The cost had been staggering. Soviet forces suffered over 300,000 casualties, including more than 80,000 dead. German military casualties were similar, but the civilian toll was even worse. Tens of thousands of Berliners died in the fighting, and many more, particularly women, suffered terribly at the hands of Soviet soldiers seeking revenge for the atrocities committed in their homeland. The fall of Berlin marked the end of Nazi Germany. On May 7, 1945, Germany signed an unconditional surrender at Allied headquarters in Reims, France. The surrender was ratified in Berlin the following day. The war in Europe was over. The city that had once been the proud capital of the Third Reich lay in ruins, a shattered monument to the consequences of totalitarianism, aggression, and hatred. The fall of Berlin was not just the end of a battle or even a war. It was the final, terrible conclusion of a regime that had brought unprecedented suffering to the world and ultimate destruction to itself.